Bernina has a fancy term that has been on every single electronic machine since they started having some type of electronics, and it is called temporary altered stitch memory. Now, what does that mean? I'm going to teach you what this means to me and how I use it. So as you pick a stitch, so obviously with a default setting, our stitches are white, or our settings are white, and when you make a stitch length longer, for example, they do turn yellow. So keep your eye on the yellow numbers as we make some changes. So when I change something from a stitch length, like I often hear my customers say they like a longer stitch length. That's just what they sew at, and they can change it. Now there is a way to permanently change that. That is another video that we will do where you can override the default settings, so when the machine turns on, it always comes up to your setting. But that's not always something I want it to be permanently set. So we're talking about a temporary setting. This would be while the machine is on. So that means when you do turn the machine off, anything that I show you is going to be cleared out unless you go and say it to be at the new Save Stitch Pattern settings. And that is in the I for information. Okay, so let's say I'm sewing along a straight stitch. I like it to be, for my project today, a 3.55 specifically. Okay, now I realize I need to go sew a buttonhole. So I'm over here at my buttonhole and I'm sewing along, and I want to go back to my straight stitch. When I go back and select stitch number 1, look where the setting is. It is still on the temporary altered settings that I changed it to. Let's do that again. Let's leave that where it is. Let's go to a zigzag. And on this project I'm working on, I am doing a very wide open zigzag. And this is the perfect setting. Once again, I need to go back to my straight stitch, continue to sew, and sew something together. Now I need to go back to my zigzag. Look, that setting has now been remembered for the setting I changed it to. You don't know how important this is until you work on other machines. Other machines, when you go to the stitch and leave the stitch, it clears out the settings. So that means that it goes back to the default settings. It'd be like me pushing clear before I left it and then not having those written down or having to have a sticky note on the machine. A Bernina will keep these settings on every single stitch. You can do needle position, you could do mirror image, you can do a lot of those functions that change the stitch for the way you need it to sew, and it will keep that all intact as you go from stitch to stitch during the time the machine is on. Isn't that awesome? Let me show you a way that I've often used this. I'm going to go back. I'm just going to clear all my settings so they're back to normal. So sometimes when I do and use a walking foot and I'm doing some machine quilting, I like to start with my stitches really close together. So I'll often take my stitch length and turn it all the way to maybe like a 1.0 setting. So see how small those little stitches are going to be? So I'm going to start off on my fabric with a couple little short stitches, maybe almost a 1/4 inch worth of stitching. And then I'm going to take my zigzag and I'm going to turn it into a straight stitch and maybe make it a little longer. So I like usually about a 3.0, somewhere in there, because I'm going through batting and seam allowances and I have all my layers together. So watch this. I'm going to be sewing my long stitches here, and then when I want to finish, I'm about ready to, I don't want to knot when I tie off, I want little tiny stitches. So I'll retouch stitch number 1. Those little tiny stitches come up, and then I'll finish, cut my threads really close to my fabric. Don't even worry about burying them. No way, I don't have time for that. But then when I start my next little area of stitching, look, it's right where I left it. Little tiny stitches for the first little bit. Touch my zigzag, it's left where I like my stitch length to be, continue sewing, and then finish that seam with the locking stitch. Isn't that so nice? I'm using 2 fingers as I stitch for this project, and all I had to do was alter my length for 1 stitch, and then of course don't forget you have to actually turn your zigzag into a straight stitch, and those stitches are right next to each other when you go to sew. Just 1 back and forth. Isn't that awesome? So try out temporary stitch memory on your machine by adjusting settings and knowing that they will stay right where you left them as you roam from stitch to stitch.